Good morning and afternoon to everyone. Today we'll be talking about ICS ATT&CK, specifically regarding creating a more cost-effective risk mitigation strategy. And this is a derivative from some joint research that Clint and I have been doing together. Just as a heads up, if you're wondering, there will be a recording distributed, and as well, there is a chat window available to ask any questions. So, before jumping into anything, we'll just do a quick introduction of ourselves. So my name's Guevara. I work as a ICS cybersecurity specialist with Grantek systems integration. I started off as a controls engineer, primarily in renewable energy, doing PLC, HMI, SCADA development. And through that, I started working more on the IT side of things, developing firewall policies and validating functionality, with different FATs, SATs, and things like that. Leading me to begin focusing more on network security. And now I'm primarily focusing my efforts around risk assessments and helping developing my clients' cybersecurity programs. And by the way, if you're wondering, I met Clint a couple years ago at the ICS Cybersecurity Conference in Atlanta, where we started discussing more on risk assessments, and which has ultimately led up to this presentation today. So that being said, I'll pass it off to Clint.
Of ThreatGEN. ThreatGEN is an ICS cybersecurity and risk management firm for industrial. I've got about 25 plus years overall in InfoSec and system security, with about 15 of those specialized specifically in industrial security. Most of that has been kind of in the trenches, doing security researcher work as a pen tester, assessments, things like that, also developing some applications. But ultimately, it all centers around the overall concept of industrial or cyber risk or cyber physical risk. Some of you may be familiar with me as one of the lead authors or one of the authors of Hacking Exposed Industrial Control Systems. So I will turn it back over. And by the way, so a lot of this, part of this presentation will be from some of the things I talk about in that book, but with the additions of the new things that we've researched and found with ICS ATT&CK. So it's kind of an extension of that. Isaac?
Sweet, awesome, thanks, Clint. So to start things off, I wanted to open up with a statement. Cybersecurity is like an endless game of chess. So there are definitely some misconceptions out there about cybersecurity being a product, an end goal, a finite thing. However, it's more like a process, and it's constantly evolving. So adversaries are looking for new vulnerabilities and ways to exploit them. And we, as the defenders, the opponent, need to be able to adapt to mitigate those risks. So today we're going to be focusing on the fact that adversaries have their own behaviors, otherwise known as tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs, which you'll hear a lot about in today's presentation. And as a defender playing this chess game, we need to understand those TTPs so that we can try to foresee what our opponent is going to do and make life as difficult as possible for our opponent, the adversary. But of course, and something that Clint and I talked about, life is never really that simple. We all know that in reality that we have limited resources, and it can be overwhelming to think about, how can I possibly defend myself against all these different adversaries? Well, that's where we need to make sure we can analyze and process our data and begin making a plan in the areas we need to prioritize most. So that being said, I'll start off today with an introduction to ICS ATT&CK. Then I'll hand things over to Clint, and he'll discuss how to integrate that into a risk mitigation strategy, something that a strategy that you may have already seen or read about if you've read through his book. Highly recommend. And from there, I'll end it off with an example. So that'll showcase how to take the concepts I went through with ICS ATT&CK and put that into your strategy to create a plan. And by the way, of course, at the end of this, we'll have some time for questions as well. What is ICS ATT&CK? Okay, so ICS ATT&CK comes from MITRE. There's also an enterprise version, and which came first, and now cloud as well and mobile. And it's a knowledge base to describe the actions an adversary may take while operating within an ICS network. So specifically, it identifies and describes different tactics, techniques, and procedures known as TTPs that adversaries may use. So let's put that back into the chess game example, where by knowing TTPs, we as defenders can detect and respond accordingly. And let's try to take that a step further and try to take proactive measures to mitigate that risk. And in addition to that, the ICS framework provides common language to make sure we're properly communicating with each other. As those of you who know in the industry, we can't even sometimes decide whether we call it OT or ICS. So just having that commonality is a good thing. Try to make sure we're all speaking the same language. And lastly, and what I think is very important, is that this is an open source community-driven project. It's evolving, and it's evolving database, and so that as adversaries adapt as well to what we're doing and they develop their own new TTPs, that knowledge base, that database is then updated so that we can adapt as well. Okay, so we're talking about TTPs. I guess just to put that into a little bit further context, we need to talk about David Bianco's pyramid of pain. So many of you might have already seen this. There's a great presentation from David Bianco himself, which again, I highly recommend looking into. But each level of this pyramid represents an attack indicator you would use to detect an adversary activity. So at the bottom there, you see trivial all the way up to the top, which is tough. So as you go up, it indicates you causing the adversary more pain when you start denying those indicators. So quick examples. At the bottom, we have hash values. So if you're trying to detect hash values for specific malware, as an example, it's trivial for an attacker to change that value, or maybe data got corrupted, who knows? So right above that, you have IP addresses. Attackers can easily modify their IP using different VPN termination points, servers, etc. So those things are pretty easy for them to maneuver around and change. Jumping just to the top of this, we have the TTPs right at the top there. So at this point, it becomes significantly more difficult to change if we're able to detect those TTPs. So making the adversary require perhaps new training, SOPs, etc. Really, at the end of the day, what we want to do is make it a costlier effort and more difficult for the attacker. So that's why we're going to be looking at ICS ATT&CK. And again, going back to the chess game example where I talked about where the two sides are not equal, we have to remember the adversary has limited resources too, and they want to catch the so-called low-hanging fruit. So that being said, let's go jump into ICS ATT&CK. So if you go on their webpage, ICS ATT&CK framework, this is what it looks like. So starting from the top here, we have adversary technical goals. This is what they are trying to achieve, the tactics. They want to move from the left to the right. So on the left, you'll see initial access, and then they'll move all the way to impact. So I'll show another example, but as I started already saying, they may gain initial access, maintain some form of persistence. From there, perform discovery, lateral movement, and then perhaps getting to their real goal of having some form of impact on your business, which we as defenders are ultimately trying to prevent. So in the rows, we have the techniques that fulfill those specific tactics. So some examples might be spear phishing attachments as an initial access, network connection enumeration for discovery, etc. And of course, as adversaries develop more techniques, like I had mentioned, then more rows would be added to their respective columns. In addition, some techniques do span multiple tactics just based on what the adversary may be trying to achieve. So now that we have just from a high level, at the very least, information on some of the tactics, how they use it, perhaps, and the techniques, we can then gain information on procedures. So clicking onto external remote services as an example, from there you would get a description of what it is, examples and references to existing adversarial attacks, mitigation steps, and on the right-hand side, you'll get some information on the types of assets in that gray box up there. And one comment that I want to make is that as you're going through this, so I do recommend definitely diving into it more. This is just an introduction to what it is. When you're taking a look, you'll notice that not all procedures have listed mitigations. And it's something that's still developing. It's still a work in progress, as I'd mentioned. So obviously, as more contributors put more content, then we'll have more well-defined mitigation steps. So that being said, though, you would want to then consider, as you're using this, using other resources like NIST 882 or IEC 62443. And those are just two examples of different things you can reference. Obviously, there's industry-specific documentation that you can use, or maybe standards, or other things that you need to use as well. But hopefully this just paints that picture that you're going to need to utilize more references to make this more complete. And of course, what I would hope for is that as this continues to grow, we can begin to depend on this more. So another piece of just more information that you can get from this are information on different types of adversary groups or campaigns. So maybe you're trying to monitor a specific group that targets your specific industry. So you can go click in and learn about, let's say, a Lazarus group. So from there, this group is associated to WannaCry, so you can get some of that descriptions there, and different techniques that they use and associated software. So as you're beginning to dive deeper into this, obviously you can begin to get into the details and learn more specifically about the different groups. Pertaining to assets, you can get what kind of assets do we find in an ICS environment, industrial control system. So we can click on the control server as an example, getting a description. The level there is relating to the Purdue model or from ISA 95, and techniques that apply to that specific asset. So hopefully this gives enough of a high-level overview. Obviously, we're limited to our time, so I'm just going to start talking about some use cases. So some different use cases. Detection. If an adversary were to get into your network, how can you start detecting their specific behavior? So you can use information from ICS ATT&CK to start building those specific detections that you want to build. Threat intelligence, tracking different adversarial behaviors, what they're doing, so that we as defenders can make the appropriate steps to either react or to breaches, or hopefully proactively mitigate them. Adversary emulation. So, this is a specific type of red teaming for planning out operations, trying to emulate what adversaries are doing in the wild and applying it and emulating that in our environments. And lastly, assessment and risk mitigation. So this is where assessing our current environment and asking ourselves, where are our gaps? How do we prioritize this in our strategy? And as you might have guessed, this is where we're going to be focusing on. So without going into it any further, I'll stop there and I'll pass it over to Clint.
Thank you. How to use the ICS ATT&CK framework for risk assessment and a more optimized risk mitigation. Let's talk a little bit about how this is a bit different than most of the other use cases that we've typically seen out there, and kind of the strategy to use. And so if you notice, if you think back to those 4 examples that Isaac just gave in the use cases, where you have threat intelligence and threat monitoring and threat modeling in that case. Those are very reactive, and they're certainly necessary, but whenever you want to look at this from a more strategic risk assessment perspective, we're going to be using this a little more proactive. And when you get into that third use case he mentioned, which was the threat or the threat emulation, such as red teaming, that's starting to get into the proactive aspect of this. But that's where we're going to focus. So ultimately, we're going to be doing a more proactive focus as opposed to the reactive focus. And we'll also talk about, when you think about this from that perspective, using most of the talks you see out there and most information you see on using ICS attack, it almost stops short in that the whole purpose of the proactive aspects of doing vulnerability assessments and pen testing and all that, or using this to model red teaming, all of that is to gain information to make your overall risk assessment and risk management more effective, more efficient, more cost effective. And so thinking of it this way almost kind of uses the ICS attack framework to its fullest potential. And that's kind of what we're getting at here. And then most people are going to want to be using a process that helps them with their overall risk management, especially when they have limited resources. So next slide, please. So when we talk about risk management, it's pretty simple. It comes down to these 4 questions. And whether you're an organization, an industrial organization, or mom and pop Circle Mart down the street, or just a person living in life, it's all about risk management for the most part. You make decisions about risk, and in business certainly. And so those questions are, what and where is my risk? What's the potential of that risk being realized, or what's the likelihood that it can happen? Or sorry, what's the impact? The second one is, what's the impact? How bad could it be? The third one is, what's the likelihood that that can actually happen? And how do I deal with that risk with the resources I have available to me? And that's the important part, because all these concepts and strategies like defense in depth and layered defense, they're great, and that's what we should be doing. However, most of the people I talk to don't have all of the resources necessary, whether it's money or time or people or all of the above, in order to purchase and deploy all of those layers. And so with limited resources, it really becomes a question of, how do I secure my organization, my business, my network, my process, and when I have all these limited resources, and how do I do that? So in order to do that, if you can answer these questions such as, okay, where is my risk? How bad can it be? How bad is that one compared to that one? And what's the likelihood it can happen? That's the equation for figuring out how to prioritize your risks so that you can make your risk management strategy more efficient and cost effective. Next slide. So how do we use the ICS attack framework to achieve a more risk-based outcome, or how does we use it to improve our process? And so I've been teaching in several presentations and documents and wherever else I talk about this, a consequence-driven approach, and that's become kind of an industry buzzword almost, but that comes from, if you're in the industry and you understand process engineering, we get that from the process hazards analysis, or PHA or HazOps. And it's important to have that consequence-driven approach, because you have to understand consequences and their impacts on the process and how that translates to a business risk. But you also have to understand the pathways to that. And so if we understand that we're protecting our process from safety hazards, production risks, and things like that, and we're following what we've learned from the industrial PHAs and whatnot, we understand that cyber is just a new vector into that risk formula. And it's the enterprise IT portion that teaches us how to consider the cyber vector into the overall PHA process. And so that's where the ICS attack helps with that. It helps merge the consequence-driven approach from a PHA with the threat modeling approach from IT. Next slide, please. So how does it do that? So how does it help us with this overall risk assessment piece how does it do that? Next slide. Yes, I put a slide in just for that. So first, let's consider likelihood. whenever it comes to the overall formula, so whether it's CISSP or NIST 830, 37, 39, or ISOs, they tell us that the formula for risk is impact times likelihood. But in impact, that's a little bit easier to figure out and ascertain, right? Because we know the criticality of our assets. We know how much money we can lose and how much, how it can affect our process and safety. We understand the impact a lot better than we know how to figure out likelihood. And likelihood is quite misunderstood and misrepresented. So if you look at, for example, CISSP's piece of the likelihood equation, which is the ARO, or the annual rate of occurrence, that's a very speculative and inaccurate calculation, because you're assuming, you're guessing, and you're assuming how many times something may happen or may not happen over the course of a year. And most likelihood attributes for most risk equations are like this. They ask you to rate, what's the likelihood of this happening? Unlikely, very likely, not likely at all, and it's just a guess. So in order to improve our overall risk equation, we have to ascertain risk in a better and more accurate way. And so if we think of it from a probabilistic determination perspective, and meaning what's the overall probability that something will happen, there are way too many variables globally and locally to figure, and there's too much math involved with probability. And I don't want to hear about artificial intelligence or machine learning or all that, because in Monte Carlo simulations or whatever you want to use, it's not the equations, and it's not the algorithms that are the problem. It's getting enough data, accurate data and quality data from reliable sources to make it mean something. So probability is pretty much out the window. Next slide. So how do we think about likelihood and measure likelihood? First of all, forget about, yes, it's okay to take into account global statistics, as, for example, this particular attack campaign is targeting organizations like mine in my industry and is attacking vulnerabilities and systems that I have. So that is one aspect that you can use, but ultimately risk is not about probability so much as it is prioritization. So think you want to look at local situations. In other words, this attack path in my network, what's the likelihood that attack path will be exploited compared to the other attack paths in my organization or in my network? And so don't think of likelihood as a probabilistic determination. Think of it more of a comparative strategy. And so that being said, if you think of it from that perspective, there are data points that you can actually measure with less presumptions, less assumptions and presumptions. And so those are things like, is there a known exploit for this vulnerability or this attack path? What access level or permissions does it require? Root or user or admin? Is it remotely accessible or only local? How complex is it? Is it easy to, and when I say complexity, I'm not talking about advanced hacker versus script kiddie. I'm just talking about, are there a lot of steps involved? Would it normally be considered complex or easy? Is there a fix or a patch you can apply? So these things you can enumerate. These things you can answer usually the yes or no, or to some degree of rating that provides weightable data to your likelihood equation, as opposed to, a WAG. So if you know what that means. Next slide, please. So if the ICS attack framework, it can help us assess the likelihood more accurately by introducing us to these tactics and techniques. And so it gives us a framework, and it gives us a pattern to look at and things to look at and validate whenever we're actually going through and doing our vulnerability assessments and our penetration testing. And so ultimately that's what you're doing. You're using the ICS attack framework to give you a roadmap of things to look at, a menu, if you will, of things to look at and weight, and to determine the pathways, and Isaac will get into it a little later, but ultimately it still requires data collection. Again, like I mentioned before, is ways of commonly doing likelihood equations is based off of speculation and presumption and made up numbers. So if we're going to look at things and we're going to look at facts and more data, that, you know, like I mentioned before in the previous slide, you have to gather that data. Next slide, please. So some of you may be familiar with this because we talk about this in the Hacking Exposed book, but this is a system that we use to gather all the relevant data for an overall risk assessment process. Now, it should be noted that a lot of people come to me and they want a vulnerability assessment or a pen test, and they think of these things either interchangeably or as individual things they need. And when in reality, all of these things in each of these steps, they provide different data points for different aspects of the equation of overall risk. And they're going to be critical in figuring out how to validate the feasibility of our attack paths within ICS attack. And so if you look at this path, you know, obviously, like if you look at the first section there, steps 1 through 4, these are the things that help you figure out consequence and impact. They help you characterize the systems, look at the criticality of the systems, what the impact is. And then the assessment portion, section 2 there, 8 through 12, this is where you're gathering all of your data from: vulnerability assessments, site walkarounds, etc. And then section, next button push, please. 11 and 12, this is where the ICS attack lives within your overall process. And by the way, it looks linear, but this is not necessarily a linear process. A lot of these steps can be done at the same time. But so step 11 is where you take all that data and you build an attack tree. In this case, we use the ICS attack framework to build our attack trees, which are feasible attack pathways or attack vectors, into our systems, which lead to an impact. And we validate those based off the findings. And so what we're going to do, next slide, is if we're looking at using the ICS attack for the first use cases that Isaac mentioned, that is really the most common in today's, you know, where people are talking about it, we're looking at the different possibilities for an adversary to use known TTPs to impact our system. Whereas if we're using it for the risk assessment, we're going to be using the process of elimination. So we're going to be looking at and then we'll cover that just next, but ultimately, so keep this in mind. What we're looking for is what are the different possibilities based off of the different assets that we have, and then we're going to do process of elimination. If it's not possible for that asset, we don't use it. And then we look at the different techniques and the procedures and we say, okay, what's possible? Here's all things that are possible. However, after doing my vulnerability assessment, etc., I know that these particular techniques are not possible, so I'm going to eliminate those. And ultimately, what you're going to end up with is, instead of a whole list of procedures and techniques and procedures in a big list, you're going to come up with a short list, and you're going to know that, okay, out of all the lists, techniques, and procedures that are possible as created by MITRE and in the community, these are the only things that I have left that I've eliminated, because I've eliminated the rest based off of the outcomes from the local data that I've gathered from vulnerability assessments and pen tests and everything from my, on my local site. So that's the difference. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Isaac.
Scenario that I mentioned. So in this, I'll be going through just an example of how to combine what we took away from learning about ICS attack and then implementing that into the risk assessment or risk mitigation strategy in the slides that Clint had reviewed. So from here, you should be able to understand a little bit more about how this starts to fit into things and how you can actually make that plan. So, in phase one, we'll go through, I'll do a short example of how we would do system identification and characterization. Really what I'm going to point out there are some of the misses that we see the things that are really critical that will allow you to make sure that you're going to be successful moving into phase 2, into phase 3 of your mitigation strategy. For phase 2, we're going to do one single example for an asset, showing you how to tie in, as shown in steps 11 and 12, ICS attack into your vulnerability assessment, and how you might make an attack path out of that. And then using those results, we'll put that into phase 3 to see how you can start creating a plan using some different simulation and models that we've made. One thing that I really do want to note before getting into this is that this is a simplistic example, and that there are definitely several complexities that come into play when you're evaluating your own environments. The purpose of this exercise is to illustrate how you can take the concepts of ICS attack and use that with that strategy and effectively make a plan. So just bear that in mind. So jumping right into phase 1 here. So step 1, identifying your stakeholders and business objectives. Again, I'm not going to go into the specific text of the boxes. Really, let's talk about some things that are critical to ensuring each step. So at this point, you definitely want to make sure you build your team and that you get buy-in from your leadership. So make sure that you bring both IT and OT personnel to the table. A big part is understanding each other's pain points, how you can both strive together to achieve the business and operational goals. Often I've heard from OT that IT doesn't care and they have their own agendas, or IT might say, the OT guys just do whatever they want to get things work. They keep throwing in all these things that are against our standards and policies. So, this is where it's key that leadership is able to understand the challenges on both sides and rally the troops together. If you've never been in the plant before as a leader, go into the plant, look at the panels, start to understand, what you're dealing with here. The more that you understand, the more you're going to be able to succeed. So in the next step, system characterization. So this is where you work with plant managers, maintenance, engineers, technicians, just examples of different individuals that might start helping you understand the different systems in place. So take the time to learn how they support operations, whether it's directly manufacturing products or goods, or if it's something pertaining to safety, as an example. Both very important. In the next step, we would do an asset inventory. So you can't know what to protect if you don't know what you have. And just labeling asset inventory there, it sounds, oh yeah, that's super simple, but it's definitely not, and it's oftentimes overlooked regarding how much effort this is. So as most of you know, plants have devices that have been in there for years, decades. I've still see some PLC2s, believe it or not. So it's imperative that you have the right personnel with you to be able to identify where are the devices, who installed them, who has history of these things. So and as I mentioned, it's very labor intensive. We got to do plant walkthroughs, we got to open up panels, look through network diagrams, if they even exist, and if they're updated, if they do exist. So what's really critical here is to make sure you have the right people to get the right information. There are also some tools that can help you make this easier. But make sure you evaluate your environments first to see what's going to work for you, especially if you're considering, like active network components that are able to, search through your network for different assets. So step 4 is a network topology and data flow evaluation. This is cyber after all, so we want to understand what's on the network. Not only that, are there devices connected via wireless, cellular modems? What other signals can you find? Again, bringing in the right people from both OT and IT will help you understand this. Other things like who manages a network? Does anyone know how things are connected? These are just really some of the basic considerations that you're going to need to make when you're understanding your systems. And hopefully, I'm starting to get the gears moving here. So Let's say we've done phase 1 now. Okay, so what's next? Well, let's move to phase 2. And for this exercise, of course, due to limited time, we're going to focus on the engineering workstation, otherwise known as, I guess from here on out, an EWS. And that's also often how it's the acronym that we call it out in the field. So, why? Well, this is or can be, the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. Adversaries are going to look for this device. It has engineering programs installed, network access, etc. So, if they're able to get access to this, and they can start performing different tactics, such as discovery, collection, and maybe even begin impairing process control directly from here. So we've picked our asset. So let's go look into putting this into context for ICS attack. So the first question that you would ask yourself is, okay, what techniques actually apply? So in my earlier slides, I showed when you click on a specific device or asset, you're able to get a view of what types of techniques that are. So here's a filtered view for you. The darker green are documented techniques that currently exist on MITRE. However, with some further evaluation, Clint and I wanted to point out some other things that could very well be applicable in lighter green. So, replication through removable media, wireless compromise, things like that. For today's example, I'm showing all the different types of techniques that are currently documented. But of course, due to the limited time, we're going to focus our evaluation on network-centric attacks. So I guess just not only for the sake of time, but let's put that into perspective of an asset owner. Maybe you're an SMB, small, medium business, and you're limited with resources. Maybe you're not able to go through this entire list immediately today. So this is where you'd want to evaluate where you're at and make a decision on where you need to put your efforts on. So that being said, let's go put it to the filtered view. All right, so now all the non-focus items are whited out. So just to add, as I had mentioned, just because they're non-focused doesn't mean that we're never going to focus on them ever. As part of your continuous improvement cybersecurity program, as I mentioned, it's like a game of chess. It's ongoing. You need to continuously evaluate yourself. They're adapting to us constantly. And of course, I'm focusing on the network part, but there's the mentality of assumed breach, right? So we need to, again, pick our focus areas. So, and this really just summarizes how there's no one-size-fits-all solution, which is why phase 1 is so important. So let's say that we've already done a vulnerability assessment on the EWS. So I'm just going to go take some make-believe data and merge that into this diagram. Okay, so what were our findings? Okay, so we have some good things that have been mitigated in blue. We have some things we need to work on red. So just as an example of what our findings might have been in this case, we found that the EWS had wireless completely disabled on the device, Bluetooth, wireless, Wi-Fi, and all. And but USBs are still allowed, and the system was accessible on the network. If you caught the earlier note in the diagram, I mentioned that the network topology is completely flat and that it's accessible from the corporate network. So there you go. So while we're here, I just wanted to walk through one single attack path and what that might look like. So let's say that there was initial access through engineering workstation compromise. And once they were able to get that initial access, they were able to perform discovery. They found that the adversary found Nmap was conveniently installed on the EWS, and from there they acted as a rogue master device, leading to a manipulation of you. This is just one example of what we could do with an EWS, and this is just one attack path. So you would then need to create your full attack tree of how this can shift into different trees or branches, paths. And not only that, but you would need to also look at the different devices that you have. And on top of that, you'll need to look at how an adversary might just pivot through the network overall. So I'll show that on this slide here. So this is just a simplistic diagram and is by no means what we suggest as best practice. I just want to put that out there. This is far from it. Hopefully you catch that with my red comments there saying not best practice. Just some quick background. I have a line in the middle to represent from a Purdue model, the different functions. So the bottom being more on the, or bottom being controls, top being the corporate side, enterprise. And that device in the middle just reflects the switch, because I mentioned earlier that it's a flat network. So all the devices are in the same VLAN. Please don't do that. So what I'm really trying to convey here is that this diagram is intended to provide a graphical illustration of what attack paths might look like in a network diagram versus how they appear in the ICS attack framework that I showed earlier. So you notice that there was an entry point into the EWS where, well, where did this come from? It could have came from the corporate network. So this is to remind folks that you need to also consider that adversaries can and will pivot from the corporate network. So in this case, you might need to, or you would need to utilize attack for enterprise to do a similar exercise. So hopefully this is just starting to show the bigger picture of things. So an example here would be maybe you have a malicious USB connected or a phishing attack to a corporate PC, so you can replace that with a mail icon. You can think of so many different ways. Wormable malware is installed. From there, the corporate PC then goes to the EWS using admin credentials it was able to gather, and they're on the same domain, so everything's trusted. So from the EWS to the controller, then is able to, some of the stuff that I mentioned earlier, using discovery with Nmap, it found the controller, and using the engineering software, they just simply modified control logic. Just an example of what they can do. So this hopefully showcases how in your overall network topology, adversaries can pivot through your network. So from here, I'm going to talk about using the data that we gathered and identifying steps. So the whole point of this presentation is to show how we can try to take the right steps. So in the next slides, we're going to go through some simulations and models of how you might start visualizing that to show how you can limit your risk. So here's an example of the effects of implementing network segmentation and monitoring controls. So I highlighted the changes in green boxes, or highlighted in the green, of the techniques that were mitigated through this specific action. Of course, this depends on your environment again, and is just really providing a visual as to how you can start using this to showcase the mitigated risk. So a point to add to that is just because you implement one control doesn't mean a specific risk is going to be entirely mitigated. An example might be where you implement network controls, but then you still need to change, still need to add controls to your end device, your EWS, through limiting services, access, maybe just altogether uninstalling software. So that's, I tried to showcase that in the yellow, with the yellow boxes. So, we can then run these types of tests through the entire database of devices that we've collected over the course of the assessment. And while this is a great way to start visualizing, of course, we're all data-driven individuals, and we want to see how these numbers actually start to look in some charts. And that's, I think, where you're going to get the most value of being able to visualize this and take this to your upper management. So here I show the gathered data and determining which techniques pose the most risk to your environment. So this diagram on the left is simply a total count of the different TTPs within specifically initial access, discovery, lateral movement, per the devices that I mentioned in our phase 1 asset inventory. So right now, the counts here are all valued at 1. You could take this a step further, where you begin giving each technique different scores based on complexity. So just some stuff Clint had mentioned earlier. In addition to that, you can use that information to start to see the effectiveness of applying the controls to your environment. Of course, these models aren't going to be 100% accurate. thus a model. However, it can start the discussion of identifying which steps are going to be the most effective to you. Then, of course, once you've implemented the control, this is just a model. Once you've implemented the control, then you validate that through pen testing, FAT, SAT, plant walkthroughs, and really checking if, let's say you had a cellular modem that was out there. You got to still go visually check that and see if you remove that. Maybe that's against your policy. So, and pose as a risk, as an initial access. So as I mentioned before, cybersecurity is an ongoing process. And as you're going through this exercise, you're going to be able to see how accurate your model is and tailor that to your specific environment. So another thing that we found helpful is, I mentioned earlier, or I showed earlier, if you caught it in the asset inventory or system characterization, that PLC1 was responsible for a line that resulted in 75% of the sales, and PLC2 was 25% of the business sales. So, again, just simplistic things, and you can weigh those values and showcase it like this. So earlier in my last slide, you saw that PLC2 was slightly higher than PLC1 from a total count, but taking that weighting, now you see that, okay, well, clearly we need to prioritize more on PLC1. For simplicity, I've left the EWS and SCADA as a weighting of 1 or 100%. And one thing to note is that you can start to get really complicated with how you do your weighting, but it's important to try and keep things simple. Remember, the purpose of this isn't to have a 100% accurate model, but it's just to start that conversation. And for most people looking to make a strategy, this is a good start. And again, if you want to get more granular, you can start looking at weighing attack paths and then correlating this to your impact ratings. So this is not a complete suite of all the different charts you can make. You can slice and dice this as many ways as you want. So the next two slides are going to show visualization, overlaying, and portraying how you can, again, take this information and really hopefully start giving some concrete steps to your upper management. So in this slide here, we have a chart showing how you might visualize network segmentation, the data from simulating the effects of network segmentation on your environment. So in the darker blue, we have results prior to control, and lighter blue, we have after control. So now you're starting to see, okay, well, clearly this is having or in theory, it's going to provide a positive impact or mitigate that risk. So now, hopefully, you're starting to see how you can create this narrative of identifying your risk, of identifying, what steps are going to provide value. And, hopefully that puts you in a position then where you are then able to go to your upper management to justify capital and use that data with much higher confidence, stating, by using this step, we can begin reducing risk by this much. And I think what's very important again is that you work with them, and hopefully as part of your team, you're continuously adjusting your models to be more accurate. So as shown on this chart that I have, it starts to showcase how applying different controls can reduce technique counts. And by reducing technique counts, you can then reduce your attack surface, thereby lowering likelihood and lowering risk. As I've reiterated plenty of times already, this isn't a perfect model. You're going to need to adjust. You're going to need to bring in the right people so that you can carefully evaluate different questions like, what are the business objectives this needs to support? What systems are critical? How does an asset tie back to the business objective? And oftentimes, and overlooked, more trivial things like, who knows the password to that device? Who installed that? How long has that been there? Why is there a cellular modem in this panel? Is a vendor still supporting that? Do we even talk to them anymore? Who are the people we need to talk to? And if you don't perform what we call these quote unquote cornerstone activities well, then your models aren't going to provide that correct narrative for creating that plan. However, if you do take the right steps by utilizing a well-defined, repeatable process, tying your data back to ICS ATT&CK, then this way and through the models, you're able to direct your efforts and limited resources to begin making a more efficient and cost-effective ICS cyber risk management plan. So that being said, that's the end of our presentation for today. Clint and I both really appreciate everyone's time. And now we're opening it up to any questions. Thank you. So a quick one for you, Clint. I see here a question for what is industrial PHA that you showed in one of your slides?
You may have also heard it called a HazOps, and this is the way that process engineers, process automation engineers identify hazards to their process by taking an all hazards approach to figure out where the risk is to that process, what the consequences may be and the impact, and how to mitigate that risk. So it's basically, in short, it's basically an industrial process risk assessment.
Sweet, thanks, Clint. So we're getting sweet. We have a bunch of other questions coming through. So here's another one. I'll take this, Clint. So are there any existing tools out there that can help visualize this? And oh, there's another one that looks very similar. So is that feature for asset highlighting built in? I tried looking and it doesn't appear to be there. So that's a really good question. So for enterprise, there is something called Attack Navigator. So you can go check that out. However, it's not integrated for Attack ICS yet. And when I was presenting, honestly, I just used Excel. So hopefully, though, they're able to add that in the future. If there's any MITRE folk here, hopefully, we could collaborate to make that happen. But yeah, so there's stuff for enterprise, but unfortunately not for ICS. Okay, so Clint, for you, how might you weigh complexity on different techniques, and where do 0 days fit into all of this?
Okay, those are actually kind of two questions, but they have the same answer, really. So, as you mentioned earlier, Isaac, you can not only weigh the asset's criticality in your final equations, but you did mention that this question is coming from the area of where you can weight the individual techniques to help you with that mitigation process and prioritization. Where you get where I would, I think you got an echo, if you can mute, Isaac. Where I would look at weighting the individual techniques would be in the vulnerabilities themselves. So notice, and this answers the 0 day question as well, notice that there's not all of these techniques are not vulnerability specific. They're more or less attack surface specific and technique based. And so there are going to be vulnerabilities and exploits tied to each of these different technique types. And I don't think that MITRE has mapped vulnerabilities and exploits to each of the techniques at this point. And in fact, I think maybe attack types, let's go back a little bit. Attack types could be translated to the techniques or attack surfaces. So I think ultimately you can look at CVEs and look at the different types of vulnerabilities that these techniques use or exploit. And they usually have some sort of you can look at the CVSS scoring as a weight. You can look at the different attributes of that vulnerability, like I mentioned when I was talking about the different data points that you want to look at for validation. Well, look and see, is it a remote vulnerability? Is it a local vulnerability? Is it, you can weight that technique based off of either like the CVSS rating of the associated vulnerabilities or the different attributes associated with that vulnerabilities. And I will tell you, weighting those techniques, it's going to require someone with the knowledge of those techniques, such as one of your own red team members or a pen tester or something like that in most cases.
Read some more of the different questions here. So one of the questions that I got was, how do you know if a mitigation plan is going to fully or partially remediate a risk? So this is it depends kind of answer. If you're looking at the different mitigations and you only see, one mitigation there, is that, well, is that really the case? Then you can probably say it fully does. However, of course, this is where, as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about referencing different standards and whatnot, best practices, you have to have that. It still requires that extended knowledge of and your own experience to be able to help you answer those questions with more clarity. And there are, and I guess as people are going through this and evaluating it more, if you're seeing that mitigation steps are missing that of, it would be great. I believe as a community, we should all take the part to contribute to this knowledge base, ICS attack, so that hopefully we can build out, help others use this to build their defenses. Yep.
I think it's important to mention, and this is whether it's cliche or not, I think ultimately risk will never be fully mitigated. And I think that ultimately your goal is to reduce the impact of that risk. You're reducing risk or reducing the impact of risk. And ultimately that's what you're looking at doing. And in this case, we're reducing attack surface or reducing technique count, which could translate to quote unquote likelihood. But that's the goal, is to reduce the risk or the risk impact as much as possible, as opposed to trying to completely eliminate risk, which I don't think can completely be done.
Yeah, exactly. So another question here we have is, why focus so much on prevention? What about, the mentality of assumption of breach? So I did mention that a little bit earlier. So, we're not saying assumption of breach is not the right mentality. It's just that more oftentimes than not, unfortunately, we're seeing that people forget just general hygiene. I really hate to say it, but
security hygiene.
Sorry?
Security hygiene, network
security hygiene. Sorry. Like we've already said before, we need to really evaluate where you are. As you're going through phase 1 and phase 2, and then phase 3, that's going to show you where you need to prioritize. As I was going to say, unfortunately, more oftentimes than not, that diagram that I went to showed earlier, I hate to say, is more common than I would like to see. And, there's definitely lots of rooms for improvement. So, and as well, in order to be able to begin doing things like monitoring and doing different forms of detection and whatnot, you have to have that network in place to begin even collecting that data. As Clint had said, that data is going to be critical to your success. Clint, do you have anything to add to that, or?
Well, so speaking of the data, on our chat panel, one of our members, I don't know if he wants me to use his name, so I won't, but he said, okay, so Isaiah, and that's Isaiah Jones, by the way, colleague of ours, he said that this framework, the ICS attack framework, he said this framework should be used during design, FATs, and SATs as well. And I could not agree more. That's the perfect place. It's exactly where you should be using these types of things. So earlier when we talked about in the use cases for, doing the threat emulation techniques and tactics and attack emulation, you should absolutely implement this into your security engineering design
Yeah.
and in doing your SATs and FATs, because this is a perfect model, and it's a perfect. Now, granted, this gets off of our topic of risk assessment management, but this is exactly how you engineer that security design into your SATs, your engineering, security engineering, etc.
Yeah, exactly. Clint, sorry to cut you off here. We got a couple seconds left. Last question: will the recording be made, and will slides be available? Yep, the recording will be sent out later today. And if you would like the slides, though, just email us. We have our contact information down there. So that's everything. I appreciate everyone's time, and thank you so much.